Okay, let me pray before we start. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Illumine our hearts, O Master, who loves mankind, with the pure light of your divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand the gospel teachings. Implant also in us the fear of your most blessed commandments, so that, trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon the spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well pleasing unto thee. For you are the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God. And unto thee do we send up all glory, together with your Father, who is from everlasting, and all holy, good, and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Okay, so we've already got to the 10th century. Now, it is true, Saint Anthony of the Kiev Caves was born at the end of the 10th century, so most of his life was in the 11th century. But because his life was surrounded by so many interesting events, I thought it would be important to speak about him. But we've already gone through half of, let's just say, the history of, well, as far as it's gone, of Christianity through the lives of the saints. A lot has happened, right? We began with Apostle Philip entering into the pagan world in what is now Asia Minor, to the first bishops and various other saints that have navigated their way through their landscape, their civilization, whatever it may be, bringing the Christian message there, transforming their own lives and transforming the society around them. And the story of St. Anthony is very similar. So let me jump right into the slides. Okay, hopefully everyone is on. Okay. I'm going to do the entire screen because it seems to work better. Okay, St. Anthony of the Kiev Caves. Now, this is quite an old icon of St. Anthony of the Kiev Caves. Now, he's often compared to, or is connected to, another saint, right, of the same name. You can remember about that saint. St. Anthony the Great, right? St. Anthony the Great of Egypt. And you can see even the habit of St. Anthony of Kiev is similar to that of St. Anthony the Great. So I know that sometimes these catechesis lessons about the lives of the saints end up being history talks. So I'm going to try avoid that as much as I can, although I think it is quite important to understand the context of where the saint is living, because sometimes we read about the amazing lives of saints or the gospel and how Christ did all these miracles and changed people's lives, and we think, well, things were different then, it was easier then to preach or whatever. But when you really look at the historical context, you realize it wasn't easy, it was probably more difficult. And that every age and every human being is given God's grace and strength to become holy, to become sanctified, and to, despite the crazy difficulties, to follow the gospel. And so it's important to understand a little bit of the history to see, despite all the odds, Christianity survived and flourished through the struggles, suffering, martyrdoms, etc. of the saints. So let's jump into a little bit of the context of Saint Anthony of the Kiev Caves. Okay, so by the 10th century, most of the Mediterranean world had become Christian. Okay. So I just want to let one more person in. Okay, sorry about that. And even some of those Christian lands who had been Christians for centuries had already been taken over by some Islamic invaders in, let's just say, Syria, Egypt, and some of North Africa. But England had, even places as far as England, had become Christian. Most of Southern Europe, what we would say, had become Christian. The kings, the rulers, emperors had accepted Christianity and was a Christian nation. And in general, the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, was flourishing at this time, even though it had shrunk in size to what the original Roman Empire was. In fact, a lot of historians actually say that it became stronger because it became more consolidated. It wasn't trying to bring all these different peoples and whatever. So, sorry, in here. But there was a huge, vast piece of land, which is what would be from Kiev in modern day Ukraine all the way up to northern Russia. So pretty much in Europe, so not far east yet, where there was a whole bunch of um, people living without any kind of real, it's a civilization. It wasn't a united kingdom. It was basically tribes living in the deep forests of the Russian land, let's just say it like that. Um, and they practiced paganism, a local paganism, also mixed with Norse paganism. And what's interesting is that in the ninth and 10th century, um, the Vikings, mostly from Sweden, began to traverse the great rivers like the Volga and to set up, kind of become the rulers of these tribes because they had they were more militaristic. They fought well. They even sometimes were asked by the local people to become the kind of rulers of the tribe. And one such dynasty developed was the Rurik dynasty. Now Rurik was probably from Sweden, um, and so he had his northern, let's just say, bases in what is now modern day Novgorod in Russia. But they, I think it was his Oleg formed a city in Kiev or a town in Kiev, which was his base. And the reason why they went so far south was because there was a trade route between Baghdad and Constantinople and Western Europe. So the Vikings were basically becoming the traders between these great civilizations. And in fact, the coinage and everything you see was passing through these lands a lot. And so when they dig up in archaeological finds, they find Islamic coins in the middle of Novgorod and Byzantine coins and all these types of things. So they were facilitating this, and they even became famous. They were called the Varangians, which were basically a Swedish Viking class that were invited, for example, by the court of Byzantium to become like bodyguard, like the special forces, you could say, because they were these militaristic people, very big men and things like that. And you can even still find in Hagia Sophia today in the church, you can actually find graffiti that they scraped in while they were at the service, like scraped into the walls in like runic writing. So um, this became the ruling class that was now based in Kiev, the kind of overseers, but they were still pagan. And there is this now Christianity was present there, was being preached by various people. Now, last time we spoke about two very important saints in the conversion of the Slavs, which were Saint Methodius and Kirill, who were Greeks from Thessalonica. Their mother was a Slav. They translated the texts and they began. Now, what happened was these Slavic um, kingdoms, like in Bulgaria, accepted Orthodoxy, and now they had their own language, written language. They obviously spoke Slavic, but now they had a written Slavic that had text that could be translated into, and they began to accept Christianity, and Christianity began to flourish in these southern Slavic kingdoms, like in what's now what was the Bulgar kingdom. And but Christianity was definitely known among the Rurik dynasty, and various missionaries were already within Kiev preaching the gospel and teaching the Slavs about Christianity. Um, and so Christianity already was known by one of the members of the Rurik dynasty, which was Helga or Olga, who was of Scandinavian descent, actually, although living in Slavic lands. And she uh, developed closer ties with Constantinople and herself decided to be baptized. Now, there's a lot of speculation. Did she do it for political reasons, or was it really true faith? And I think it was a mixture of everything. Uh, they were looking for, and there's a lot of, we'll talk about the story of her grandson, but she herself became a Christian, and she went to Constantinople to be baptized. And there's actually a very interesting story about Saint Olga, is that she went there to be baptized, and Emperor Constantine actually uh, loved and wanted to marry her, to establish this kind of also connection between the two peoples. And she said she doesn't want to marry until she gets baptized. But what she did was she asked that he become her godfather, as we do in baptism in Christianity. And she actually tricked him because in the Orthodox canons, a godfather or godmother is not allowed to marry their godchild, right? There's actually canons against that because you're not family, right? And so then she was able to, because she didn't want to marry Constantine. So she was able to trick him and she said, no, you can't marry me now because you're my godfather. And you can't stop that. So anyway, so she went back to Kiev, and there she had influence over not her son. So she tried her best to convert her son, Sviatoslav, to Christianity, but he refused. But she had great influence over her three grandchildren, especially Vladimir. And he was called and came closer to Christianity. And ultimately, only later on in his life, he actually chose to follow Christianity. Here's a nice, found some cool epic paintings for you guys tonight. But as you probably all know the story, as this town in Kiev, which was the center of the Rurik dynasty, became stronger. Yes, is there a question? You can just put on the mic and ask.
Father, it's Laura. Sorry
Right.
to interrupt. I just wanted to ask about that icon, Saint Olga. What does she have
Yes.
in her hand? I noticed she had a cross and then what looked like a
It's a little church.
Oh wow.
So
Okay.
yeah, she wasn't a model maker. Oftentimes, so this is an icon painted by Vasnitsov, which is a 19th century painter. He developed a kind of academic iconographic style. It's actually quite an amazing style, and you can go to churches in Russia and Ukraine with these types of icons. It was a very short period where they painted like this, but in the general iconographic tradition, saints often hold things associated to what type of saint they are. So, for example, if someone was a founder of a church or founder of a monastery, then they often are holding that church in their arm, like Saint Elizabeth, for example, the new martyr who built the Saint Martha Mary convent. She'll always hold that in her hand. And Olga was the same. Because she was a patron of Christianity, she built the first church, from what I understand, in Kiev. And that's a copy now. Kiev was a wooden city, like most cities in Russia, in Greater Rus, let's just say. It was very rare to find a brick or stone building because they had so much wood and they had so many carpenters, masters at carpentry, that the cities were mostly made of wood. And usually, in time, they would build a stone church, and that would be the center of the town, and that would be like an amazing experience for the people because they didn't usually have any other buildings that weren't wood. So there's a little wooden church she's holding, which is the first church in
Okay, thank you.
yeah. So Vladimir, seeing that he wanted Kiev to become not just a great city, but the Rurik dynasty, let's say, to become great, he wanted a religion that would be fitting of that. And already at that time, paganism was too scattered; it wasn't taken as seriously. The mythologies were becoming less powerful, in the sense that coming into contact with people talking about the one true God, naturally the people began to doubt their mythology, right? And this has happened to the Greeks as well. There was a greater faith, a greater understanding. that wasn't so legalized in a sense. And so he went and sent out emissaries to find the right faith. Now, it's interesting, the Rus people had choice, right? As we spoke about this before, because already like large, let's just say powerful religions had become established all surrounding them. You had the Latin Christians of the West, although the church was still one at this period, although coming to the end of coming they had the Byzantine Empire in its zenith, showing Eastern Christianity, and Hagia Sophia was also at its peak, let's just say, of liturgical worship, etc. Then they had Islam to look at in the Khanates, and even Judaism. But because of the worship that was taking place and the beauty of the worship, among other things, but the general understanding is that they chose the faith of the Byzantines, of the Christians of Constantinople, because of the beauty of the worship. And this is definitely the case, because you can see how Russia or the Rus people tried to emulate that, and we'll discuss that as well. They were really inspired by this bringing heaven to earth, and that the theology itself of Christianity is a theology of beauty, right? If God is good, and beauty, and that which is good is beautiful, right? That's where we get the word philokalia from. And therefore, our faith must be beautiful. The way we experience our life is the way we speak to the world is beautiful, and our human being should reflect that. So Vladimir then brought Christianity to Kiev. He did make some big changes. Now, he was a famous, powerful pagan. He had wives to rival Solomon in number. He ruled through violence in his earlier time. So remember, these are Vikings we're speaking of. So they ruled with great violence, because they were trying to bring all these various warrior tribes together. So that's what he knew. But we see great changes took place in him after his baptism, and then him baptizing the people in the Danube. They were baptized in the river by Kiev. So the first thing he did was he destroyed the pagan idols, and they threw them into the rivers. Most of the idols were actually large wood. They looked like totem poles kind of thing. And they had a whole pantheon of gods. We won't get into too much. And destroyed the pagan temples, and he built churches on them. Also, an amazing thing was, because they now had this alphabet to use, schools in Kiev exploded. Apparently, the literacy went from 0 to like almost 100% within a very short period of time. And he also kept only one wife. And that was a difficult thing. It actually came back to destroy the dynasty in a sense, because all his sons, which became illegitimate sons because he only kept one wife, because he had too many pagan wives and things, so he kept one Christian wife. There was warring between them later on. So Vladimir brought Christianity to Kiev, but the big problem was how to get a whole bunch of Vikings, pagan Vikings, to become real Christians. And this is where we get the meeting of these saints like Saint Anthony of Kiev and other saints that we'll meet tonight, trying to bring, because it's one thing to outwardly accept Christianity, but the heart needs to change. And so Vladimir definitely began these changes in himself. Firstly, he stopped kind of his previous ways, but now it took a lot of time to get his sons and the dynasty to become Christian. And that's what we'll talk about a bit. So one thing that's really interesting is that when you look at the story of how Christianity came to the Rus and how it came to, let's just say, the Greeks, there's like a pattern that the Rus kind of took that existed. And one of them was, the first thing was, is really interesting, is how Vladimir became Christian through influence of an older female figure in the family, just like Constantine the Great. So Constantine the Great, his mother Helen was a Christian first before he became a Christian, and it was through her influence that together with divine intervention, that Constantine accepted Christianity. And in a very typical Russian fashion, because the Russian grannies have a great influence over Russians. if you speak to the average Russian, they'll have good memories about how they love their granny, and their babushka took care of them and took them to church. That's still a very thing, like thing I still experience as well. You'll meet someone that hasn't been to church for ages, and they'll say, "Oh, yes, I remember going to church as a child with my babushka, with my granny." So this is an ancient tradition where Olga herself took Vladimir probably to church, which then sowed the seeds for him to be Christian. So that was yeah.
I just wanted to say another interesting thing about this pattern is they're not sure where Helen was from exactly. One of the stories is that she actually came from Britain. So it's this older female figure from the edge of the world, because Olga's also of sort of Viking heritage.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it's like the feminine persuasiveness, if it's used correctly, it can bring the wild male into like his better self. Let's just say it like that. And so that was one pattern. So even in the church, we have the equal to the apostles, Constantine and Helen, and Vladimir and Olga. And so they're seen as like this pair of equal to the apostles that brought Christianity to their people. Okay, that was the one pattern that developed, that took place. The other was the establishing of a city was established with the building of the Church of Holy Wisdom. So just like Holy Wisdom, which represents Christ, and remember, the wisdom of God established the world. The word of God, when God spoke, he brought the world into its order. And so that whole idea of building a city is kind of like the same thing. You're taking this wild place, this wooden city, and now you're saying, how are we going to establish something greater? And so you call down Holy Wisdom, Jesus Christ, to enter in, and you dedicate the main church to that. And that's what they did. And they built the stone church of Hagia Sophia, which this is what it looked like in its earlier days, built by a Byzantine craftsman. Nowadays, the Kiev Lavra is the same church, but it's covered with kind of Baroque domes, so it looks much newer, but it's actually an ancient church. I'll show you a picture. There it is. So that is the same church that you see, these domes here. That is the exact same church. It's just been elaborated on with Baroque style. The bell tower is newer.
So you're saying that Lavra, the Kiev place was built like the original Hagia Sophia?
Yeah, it was smaller.
Smaller, but it was based on the previous version of Hagia Sophia.
Yeah, I mean the dome was smaller. It wasn't the same architecture, but the idea of the main church. Anyway, so that became also a pattern. And even the fresco, I mean, the mosaics that still exist, so that all came into place. And also the idea as the ruler being a kind of under God and trying to bring, and the responsibility of the ruler was to be the protector of Christianity, right? The promoter of Christianity. And that it was seen in the coinage and all those types of things. This is an ancient old coin with Vladimir on. Okay. And you see, they even had, it was a very different style, you could say. It wasn't as grand and as let's just say the scale wasn't as big, but the pattern was the same. And this is one of the original mosaics made by a craftsman, Byzantine craftsman. And here's an icon, very famous mosaic of the Theotokos, and it's a very kind of straight and very kind of rigid mosaic. But there's a part of the hymn of the Akathis that speaks about the Theotokos, the Virgin Mary, as a wall, like a protectress. And so sometimes she was depicted as like this protecting figure. And there's a lot of interesting details in this mosaic. I actually went to a whole lecture, like a 2-hour lecture, just on these bottom mosaics of Christ giving communion, basically. And there's Saint Peter here on the left. And if you look at the details, this was made during the time of the schism, the Great Schism between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. And Peter's hands So Christ is not touching Peter's hands while he's touching, I think it's Apostle Paul or John on the right. There's this almost this slight symbolism of how Peter has now lost communion, out of communion with Christ. So already the craftsmen were putting this slight, very, very subtle commentary, how Peter has, not Peter himself, but the bishop of the descendant of Peter, you could say, as a successor of Peter, has now left communion with the body of the church. Anyway,
So this is very old. We're talking like nearly 1,000 years
it's a
old.
1,000-year-old mosaic.
Sure.
Yeah. So it's interesting because you go into the church and you go into the church and it looks very Baroque from the outside, but you go in and you see these ancient mosaics. Yeah. So it just got a lot of layers on top of it. So this is a complex of the Kiev caves, Lavra, which we'll get to now. Okay, so now let's. So before I talk about our hero of tonight, so what does this mean? So Christianity had come to Kiev, and the rulers were trying to make it a patronate towards Christendom, right? Which was very good. But Christendom is nothing without a heart, without a soul. And so it took people like St. Anthony to bring the real treasures, let's just say, of Christianity, which is the inner life, the spiritual life, those riches. And so this already began providentially. Now, he was born the end of the 10th century, so 980 something. And his name was Antipas, and he was born to Christian parents. So it's interesting, he wasn't a pagan. So he was one of the early Christians of that time, born basically at the time of the baptism of Rus. Okay. And from what we know from the stories about him is that from a very young age, he was a very serious child, didn't like to play with the kids. He showed kind of signs of asceticism and signs of seriousness. And so at a very young age, probably in his early teens, he went to Mount Athos, which already at that time had become the great center of monasticism. Now, Mount Athos was not just a Greek monastery. In fact, Mount Athos was a collection of monasteries from all over Christendom. So it had, when Egypt and Syria was taken by Islamic invaders, many ascetics went to Athos to find refuge because they were seeking a life of solitude, prayer, and study. And so Athos kind of absorbed all these monastic traditions. So it became a real center that drew monastics, and it drew who was then Antipas, who became Antonius, and he lived there, and he gained the respect and love of the monastics. They saw that he was achieving great kind of growth in the spiritual life, but his abbot, his igumen, and when he was tonsured as Anthony. So providentially, he was tonsured as Anthony. And it's interesting, his igumen. So Anthony had no desire to go back to Kiev, right? He didn't want to go back. He wasn't from Kiev, in fact. He was from Chernihiv or something. He didn't want to go to his past life, right? He's like a Jonah figure in a way. He wanted to stay in Athos. He was happy there, and you can see through his character that he loved the secluded life. But his abbot said, no, your people are now becoming Christians, and Kiev has now become Christian. You must go and help them and bring monastic life there. And so he did that. He was obedient, and he went to his homeland, and he went to Kiev, and he found there in the outskirts a hill. And that hill actually already had a small cave that was dug by an existing Christian ascetic. And there were actually monasteries already in Kiev. There were Greek monasteries. So it's interesting. In early Kiev, the liturgy did not take place in Slavonic, it took place in Greek. And most of the monastics were imports from Constantinople or from the Greek-speaking lands. So it's very interesting. It didn't just immediately, there was a transition period. And that's why even in church today, when a bishop comes in Russia, let's just say, if a bishop comes to serve at a local church in Russia, choir, still in the rubrics, it still sings the Greek, some of the Greek words like ispolati, despota, and these Greek words, because in the very, very early church, the bishops were all Greek or Greek speaking. Okay, not necessarily Greek ethnically, but Syria or whatever. And so the Russians had this, they got their Christianity from the Greek speaking world. So Anthony found a hermit there, and he took his abode in the cave, and he dug a cave for himself where he basically would pray and serve. And this got attention, right? And the hill in which this was, where he dug, had a very special kind of stone that worked well for digging deeper caves. Basically, he began to do this. So you must remember, at this period, it was a very, very turbulent time, a violent time, and Anthony was seeking a place of refuge. So I always think, if you go to modern day Kiev, you can even tell, like, it's beautiful, vast, open hills and forests and beautiful river. Like, why would a Christian go there and then dig himself into a hole? Like, when you could just make a nice little wooden church and just, But I think he was seeking after safety, solitude, seclusion from the worries of this life. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about this, the whole idea of the caves, because we find many, many monasteries in Christianity in caves, in the earth. And so, yes, here's a nice image of Anthony digging his first cave. And his asceticism, his seriousness, it says in the Chronicle that he didn't like the way the monasteries were being formed in the city of Kiev. They were too relaxed. They weren't as serious about keeping the prayer rules, etc. And so he wanted to be secluded and keep a more stricter ascetical life, which is why he dug his cave. Now, before I do that, I wanted to talk about life in the caves. Now, unfortunately, I haven't been into the caves, but my Anastasia has, and I know many people who've been to the Kiev Lavra, and that you can still go into the caves that were dug by the early monastics, so like 1,000 years ago. And this, if I'm not, Anthony's cell, and this is his bed. So, this is basically, I don't know if the wood is original, but this is basically the kind of places they would live, and this is what it looks like. Here's there's many saints from the Kiev Cave Lavra. Their relics are all kept in the caves, but there's lots of little tunnels and chapels, and it's in the depths of the earth, and this gives you a feel of what it was like, but no natural light. The caves are quite dry, and they're not kind of like uncomfortable in that sense. The temperature actually remains pretty stable, But the thing is, we have so many we see a pattern as well emerge in Christianity, where we see in Ethiopia lots of cave churches. In fact, the best churches are all dug into the stone. In Cappadocia, immense systems of caves and houses and churches. This is a church, I think, from Bulgaria, cave church, and we can count many, many others in Western Europe as well. So you see, the idea of a cave, I would say, it begins with the Christian story of Christ being placed in the tomb, in rock cut out of the earth, and the whole transformation of the experience of death and being placed in the earth was changed, because, as we believe as Christians, Christ entered into the darkness of death even and brought light to it. And it's the same thing with the tomb. The tomb becomes the beginning points of Christianity, of the Christian life. And so, the myrrh-bearing woman, when they went to the cave, they found the truth, they found the light, they found the risen Lord. And so I think that started a kind of Christian longing to be at the tomb. But I would also say that the cave became, in a world that we don't really understand, how violent, how chaotic, how dangerous it was just even physically, like the elements. People didn't have the luxuries that we have of shelter that's so nicely done. And wild animals, diseases, plagues, armies, that entering into the earth and finding a kind of place of peace, a place of seclusion. It's like entering into the secret place and shutting your door and praying to the Lord there. And so I would say that this is evidence of it, that Christians long to that. And we always, when we see these caves, or when we go there, when people visit these cave churches, I haven't met one person that's been to the Kiev caves monastery and gone to the caves, because obviously it's lots of churches on the surface now. But when you go to the caves, to the cells, every single person I know that's been there has been touched or moved by the power of that place. It's filled with prayer. It's filled with something special, filled with light. And I think there's something paradoxical as well about that. The cave is a place of darkness and fear, and it becomes a place that's now filled with spiritual light. And this is definitely what Anthony did by digging his first cell into the cave. Maybe it comes from even pre-Christian times when we were cavemen. I don't know.
Well, I mean, if we're going into the earth, might as well get started before we die.
Yes, it's like a pre-burial. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that the authenticity of Saint Anthony and his ascetical life attracted serious Christians that wanted to follow him. So he developed lots of disciples. And it's interesting, though, Anthony always tried to kind of not become the leader. So when he got 12 disciples, then he set up another kind of abbot, you could say, and he started to make different caves. And that's why you actually have the near caves and the far caves of Kiev. So the near caves was the first caves that he dug. Then he got too famous. Too many monks came. Then he left them. He said, I'm out of here. I want solitude. And he went further and he dug a deeper cave. And those are the far caves.
It's a bit like Christ. He gathered his disciples and then
exactly. Yeah, he went to the mountain, so he went to go pray alone. So Anthony was the same. He was really authentic. Like, he wasn't seeking any kind of, he wasn't becoming an ascetic in Kiev so that he would be famous and become a saint or something. He was really seeking a place of solitude, but he was also being obedient to his abbot in Mount Athos, who said, you must go help your people now. And also, he had problems with the local rulers. So now at this time, when he was older, Izyaslav, which was this son of Yaroslav, I think, the wise, he was a ruler of Kiev. And he wanted to take back some of the men who had become monastics. And one of the merchant, the boyar, he said, no, you must take him out the monastery. I need him for something. And then the abbots, because Anthony had moved away, said, no, you can't take soldiers away from the kingdom of heaven. So this monastery of the Kiev caves was very, it helped to bring the rulers who had just become Christian, but were not acting very Christian, into check, if I could say that. And I would say that the Kiev Caves Lavra has done that up to the present day. The famous 2000, so I'm jumping now 1,000 years ahead, but in 2014, when this military conflict, this coup happened in Kiev, there's a famous, we watched it live on TV, but for those of you who weren't watching that news at the time, when there was the government soldiers fighting kind of people trying to topple the government, the Kiev monastics from the Kiev Cave Lavra, they stood in between them with all the rocks being thrown. There's a famous photo actually of 3 monks standing with crosses, kind of asking them to like lay down and make peace, basically. And they were in the crossfire of the bullets and the tear gas and the stuff. So the Kiev Caves has been doing this for 1,000 years, basically, being going against the rulers who were often not very Christian.
Although a boyar is some sort of a merchant.
Boyar is a merchant.
Okay.
Yeah, boyar. I just don't know the English, but it's like a merchant, yeah. So I'm jumping a little bit in history, but so with the death of Vladimir the Great, so the ruler who brought Christianity, the interesting thing in the Rurik dynasty and in this kind of Kiev and Rus is that they didn't have such the way of succession was done very differently. And I think it had to do with the fact that there was such huge lands available to the rulers. They didn't have actually one heir. All of the sons would become heirs to the kingdom, which was a kind of dumb thing in a way, because of course they're going to start wanting to kill each other to consolidate power. But the idea was that the sons of the Tsar, or not the Tsar, sorry, I'm kidding, of the prince, the grand prince, the sons of the grand prince would become their own princes of the princely states in a city, right? In different cities all over this huge land, which is the land of the Rus. And this is what happened. But when Vladimir the Great died, there was a fratricidal war between Vladimir's sons, Yaroslav, Svyatopolk, especially between Yaroslav and Svyatopolk. Yaroslav was, let's just say, a greater Christian. He had accepted Christianity in a more serious way. Svyatopolk, not so much. He was, in fact, known as the Cursed. Because, Vladimir's other sons, Boris and Gleb, were killed by Svyatopolk. I'll tell you about that story then. But again, the Kiev caves became this place of sanctuary. Now, it's interesting. Anthony, when this happened and there was this war happening, he fled back to Mount Athos. He said, no, I don't want to deal with this anymore. But he was sent again back when the conflict ended. He was sent by his abbot back to complete what he had begun with the Kiev monastery. So he had his Jonah moments. So I want to tell you about the story of Saint Boris and Gleb. Also, very beautiful saints. And when you learn about Orthodoxy, they pop up. You see this icon of two brothers standing together. And so what happened was, and this is what I want to try explain about how a society or how a kingdom or whatever becomes Christian. It's not just immediate. It takes people making choices, doing something differently. And what happened was, Boris and Gleb, who had become devout Christians following in their father's footsteps, learned that their brother Svyatopolk, who they loved their brother, was going to kill them because he wanted to consolidate power, whatever. And they said, we will not take up arms against our brother. So it's an interesting kind of form of Christian pacifism in a sense, but it was more than that. They were courageously wanting to stop the cycle of fratricidal warfare. And so they obviously wished to show their brother an example that they're not going to, because they had a choice to then raise up their own army, which is what usually they did, would be to raise up an army from your own base of power and go fight your brother. And whoever wins takes their lands, right? But they chose not to. So here's, I'll read how they were killed, just to let you know. So Svyatopolk sent assassins to kill Boris, who already knew that his brother wanted him dead. When they arrived, they heard him chanting psalms and praying before an icon of Christ. He asked the Lord to strengthen him for the suffering he was about to endure. So he knew that he was going to be killed, and he chose just to accept it. And he also prayed for his brother Svyatopolk, asking God not to count this against him as sin. And then as he lay down on his couch, the assassins stabbed him with their lances and also killed some of Boris's servants. And they wrapped him in a cloth and they took him on a wagon. And all of the chronicles show that he was actually not dead yet. They could hear him breathing. And then when they heard of that, when Svyatopolk saw that he was still breathing, they stabbed him with swords to kill his brother. And then he sent to kill Gleb, the younger brother. And again, he tried to trick Gleb and said, oh, your father's still dying. He hasn't died yet. Come to see your father. And so Gleb came, and he was murdered actually on his way. And he was murdered by his own cook, who basically became an assassin for Svyatopolk. But both of them became the first, let's just say, saints or types of martyrs in Rus. They're the first martyrs, but they have a special title called the Passion Bearers. And what that means is, so you'll often see in the icons of them, you'll say Strastatiepse, which is the Slavonic, but it'll say the Holy Passion Bearers, Boris and Gleb. And that basically means someone who is willing to endure suffering um, in order to minimize or to stop bloodshed, to stop violence. It's like taking on something on yourself, because they weren't killed for Christ. Remember, they were killed because they were in the way of the brothers' thing. But because they were Christians and because they believed that they shouldn't take up and kill one's brother, they chose to accept this death. Now it's interesting that in the Russian church, there's another group of saints with that title. Can anyone guess?
It's the royal family.
Yeah.
Oh.
So the royal family of Russia have the same title because again they were not killed for Christ. It's not like the Bolshevik soldiers said, "Do you believe in Jesus? If you don't, we're going to shoot you." They didn't do that. They killed them for political reasons. But the reason why Saint Nicholas abdicated when he didn't need to was in order to stop bloodshed. And all of their choices surrounding the fact that they suffered and ultimately died was so that they could be Christian examples. So it's interesting how it's kind of enveloped this in our times, with these, because there's not many saints that have that title. But Boris and Gleb became the first Christian bloodshed in a kind of martyric way in the Rus. And they became, and many churches were dedicated to them as these great examples of that. Okay, which is
we commemorated them in August last year.
Yeah. And also what's interesting is that think of a Viking mentality. Right. This is like the flip side of that, because for them it's like you must die with the sword, you must die fighting, and to die like that was not something that would be seen as a good thing in the Viking mindsets, right? So this is already seen as a conversion to a Christian mind for people. Now, we see this generally in the life of Saint Vladimir, Saint Boris and Gleb, is this forming of a Christian conscience within society. And we see again how this happened when Anthony, in the monastery, living the monastic life, teaching the people about the monastic life, when Izyaslav, which was the son of Yaroslav, the wise, came to ask for a blessing when some people were there was some war going on, and Anthony didn't give his blessing. He said, "No, you won't, because of your sins." And he said, "You will be defeated because you're sinful." And he didn't give his blessing, so he actually wasn't very popular among the ruling class because of this. Now, I have to give some modern commentary about what's happening now in Russia and Ukraine. Is that to me, I feel that both Russia and Ukraine, the answer to this bloodshed is found in the saints in that land, Boris and Gleb, because they showed that the fratricidal fighting, seeking after power, and both sides are guilty. They should look to the great saints of the early church, which is Boris and Gleb, how they chose to, in order not to plunge their society into this never-ending war. One of them, they chose to accept violence in order that they would stop it, let's just say it like that, and become an example of Christianity. And I don't think either side has ever considered that, at least in the political realms. So hopefully the political people that are behind all of this, that really have Christian faith, and look at this as an example. That's just my little commentary there on that. Okay. Now, Anthony, as we can kind of tell from the little bit that we know about him, he was seeking after his life in Christ in isolation, and he didn't want to become this great abbot. And so let me read how he found his success. When the monastery was completed during the abbacy of Varlam, who became the abbot after Anthony, Baram had departed the brethren. He visited the aged Anthony who founded the monastery, who was now living in deep seclusion. And Baram, the abbot, said, "What shall we do?" And he requested, "How shall we get a new abbot for them?" And then Anthony, in his isolation, he was like the starets, right? The Yeronta. And he said, "Who of them?" Uh, he replied, "They required only one designated by God and by his own selection." And then he inquired of them, "Who among you is the most obedient, most modest, and more mild than Theodosius? And let him be your abbot." So for Anthony, it was very important to choose the most humble, the most mild, as in not violent and all these stuff, power hungry. And this was one of the monks that was Theodosius. And so he was chosen to be the successor. And he became the abbot. Now, it's interesting because Theodosius had a total different character to Anthony. Theodosius was a more outward saint. And he took the monastery, the cave monasteries, which was basically a hermetical, hermit style, secluding oneself from the earth, and he turned the monastery into, let's just say, like a center of learning, of almsgiving, and all these various things. And so, and he won great respect from also the aristocracy as well. And so it's interesting when we commemorate Saint Anthony, we commemorate Theodosius as well. Saint Anthony and Theodosius of the Kiev caves, because they come together as this kind of these two parts of not only monastic life but the Christian life, and the inner and the outer life. Anthony became the example for us Christians that we have to ourselves in our prayer life have a cave that we go to, even if it's our hearts. In fact, that's the real cave we need to all enter into, is the inner depths of our being in our prayer, where we find silence despite all the crazy stuff going on in the world. And that's essential, even if no one knows what we're doing. And there's an interesting story about Saint Anthony, that no one knows where his relics are. They're in the cave somewhere. But what he did was he dug himself a grave within this complex of caves, and he told his disciples to bury him and tell no one where his relics are. And so no one knows actually where Saint Anthony's relics are. But people go to the caves and pray and ask for his intercession because they know his presence is there. But he didn't want anyone to know where he was. And while Theodosius, on the other hand, turned the Kiev caves Lavra into a great center that went out into the world, and it became the original great Lavra of the Russian people, where, and even, okay, well, now it's a very complicated thing, we won't go into it. It's very sad, but part of history, but the end is not yet come. But people that I knew that went to the Kiev Caves monastery when it was still functioning like fine and everything, they would say it's amazing. Like you go there and they're like making candles, and they've got a huge soup kitchen for pilgrims, and people go there to study for seminary, and there's all these, it's like a complex of things happening. And that's like the legacy of Theodosius, yet it also has the caves, right, where people go and they are moved deeply by it. So I think that is a great example for us as Christians, where there's these two things, and they're not they need to be pulled together. As Christians, we need to have an outer life. We need to give ourselves all to help society in some ways we can, but also have an inner life. And so these two saints bring that together quite beautifully. Now, just to end off, yeah, we're right, just on time. I'll tell you, sadly, the Kievan Rus, Kiev, didn't last very long. It, in fact, only lasted really, what was it? 2.5 centuries in its Christian heyday. And unfortunately, the most powerful warriors of the world at that time, the Mongols, set their eyes on the Rus coming from the east. And ultimately, they took Kiev and destroyed Kiev. And what happened was this dynasty and the ruling people and many of the people went more north. And so all the cities that were connected to them, because remember, these people came from the north. They came from Novgorod, all these very northern Rus cities. The center of power shifted and it moved to places like Vladimir, uh, Novgorod, Suzdal, and ultimately to Moscow. Which is why it's a very complicated history with this modern war happening. People get a little bit confused about it, but it's all connected. So I'm going to read you a short story, well, a short explanation of how Kiev fell. So it was the siege of Kiev, which was completed and ended on December the 6th in 1240. And that basically destroyed the Russian Empire, or no, not the empire, the Kievan Rus, basically. And so I'll read it for you. On the eve of the Mongol invasion, Kiev was, despite political turmoil, still the mother city of Russia. Whichever prince held Kiev became the great prince of all Russia. And it's the same with the metropolitan. It's interesting. So the metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus, that was a title given by Constantinople to the metropolitan. So even, for example, when Kiev fell, the metropolitan, which was the highest cleric in the church, went to a different city like Suzdal. He was still given the title the metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus, because they remember they didn't have a patriarch yet. They were still just metropolitans. After the Mongols under Genghis Khan's grandson Batu destroyed several cities of northern Russia, Ryazan, Vladimir, Tarzok, and Kozelsk, in 1238, the Mongols turned their attention to the steppe. And in 1240, Batu's cousin, Mongke Khan, inspecting Kiev from across the Dnieper, I was saying the Danube earlier, I meant the Dnieper, sent an envoy summoning Prince Michael of Cherniv, who was then holding Kiev, to surrender. Michael of Cherniv fled. He ran to Hungary. He didn't want to fight the Mongols. They were just too powerful. So he fled. He fled Kiev, and Kiev was left. So no one wanted to take control of Kiev because they knew they were going to probably die. But the commander, Dmitry, put together a final resistance. So he himself said, no, I'm going to protect Kiev. And they had 1,000 men, and the entire Mongol army camped outside Kiev. And they had catapults, and they began to basically destroy the walls. Now, you must remember, Kiev was not a walled, didn't have a fully stone wall surrounding the Kremlin of its day. So they managed to destroy the walls, and they entered into the city, and the people all rushed into the great church of the Blessed Virgin, which was a stone church. And they climbed up into the higher chambers of the church, and that actually collapsed the walls. And basically everyone was killed. The whole city was butchered. Like, there was no mercy, except for Dmitry was spared because he died in a brave way. Oh, well, no, he fought in a brave way, so they didn't kill him. He was probably tortured and made a slave or something. I don't know the history. But it was a very violent, terrible end, dark time, because this great Christian city was basically destroyed and everyone was killed in it. But Rus remained, and later on we might get to part of the history where finally the Christian people got back their land from the Golden Horde, that was called, of the Mongols who were oppressing them. But so Kiev and the Rus lived a very short period, actually. But within that period, a lot of important saints came about, like Saint Anthony and Theodosius, Boris and Gleb, Vladimir and Olga, and very many other saints. And they became this pattern, this prototype for Christianity as it continued. So, and we thank Saint Anthony and Theodosius for bringing monasticism to the Rus, and it was from there that monastic life continued. Anthony brought the hermit, secluded style of monastic life, which still exists today in Russia. The elder living far away in the forest, living far away in the deeper parts of the monastery, is still very much a tradition in Russia, while yet the Theodosius, who brought the Studian style of monastic life, which is more ordered and more communal, is also part of it. So they set a kind of foundation for that. But that's all I wanted to talk about for tonight. I'm trying to keep on time so we don't fall asleep. Uh, but are there any questions or objections? So I was calling the river the Danube. I meant the Dnieper. Any questions?
I don't have a question, but just basically a comment about
Yeah.
you were saying you haven't met somebody that's been to the, well, I think you were talking specifically of the Lavra, the caves, and just how moving that they can be. I just have to comment. I mean, yeah, obviously, as you know, we were very blessed and lucky to go to Cappadocia. And I mean, we did that. We went and saw a lot of these small cave churches, but also I think that were just little caves for hermits, very simple, secluded. Because if you around Gurumir, there's the various valleys, and you can just go and walk the valleys and go cave and fresco hunting. It's awesome. And
Amazing,
but it
yeah.
was. But it really, really was very, very moving. To be honest, for me personally, experiencing those caves is a big part of like me coming back to Christianity. Just like what I felt in those caves was quite phenomenal, really. So I just had to comment on it because it really is something very special in those caves.
Absolutely. I mean, that's amazing. So I don't even know really how to describe it. I just wanted to also just point it out that there's a pattern in Christianity where people are drawn to caves, and there's something that is just powerful, the prayerfulness of that seclusion and that's entering back into the earth. And I've also been to churches that are this raccoon type of churches, you know, wherever it may be. And there is something powerful about it, yeah, for sure.
I remember Matushka talking about, because she's been to Kiev caves, saying like, even if you're alone in the place, there's a warmth, and you're not alone. I mean, the saints are there.
Yeah.
You know. But you were talking about Cappadocia, Alfred. I've got friends of mine. They're not Christian, very, very much not Christian, and they were blown away by it because they were hiking through Cappadocia and they would stumble upon these random cave churches, these frescoes. They're not even in use. They're just lying there for people to find, and they just found that incredible.
I mean, there's also somewhere that some like a local somebody has, I don't know, put up a door and locks and stuff like that, where it's you don't even know like who's looking. I don't know. It's quite something. You can really sense the history, but also like because I mean there was a few that we found that was locked up like that, and you like peer through and you can see there's frescoes in there. And some of them are like really, really based. Some of the caves where they're not locked up and whatever, but you go in there and it's just really just very, very basic, not any like sort of extravagant frescoes, but just very simple designs that I think were Christian. But they really, I mean, it's one of, if ever you can do it, to go to Cappadocia or somewhere similar where you can just go hiking for a day or an afternoon, a morning, or whatever, and just go and see what you can find. It really is. It's a very, very special thing.
Yeah.
No question about it.
In the liturgy of Saint Basil the Great, one of the prayers is for those who are in the caves of the earth. And I think because he was from Cappadocia, I think in his time, and obviously later as well, most of his frescoes are from later, but there were so many Christians who decided to take up their lives within the earth. And all of that requires a lot of things. So, for example, like you need to bring your food and store it, and light candles or light something to have light. So it's a very different way of life, like in a sense, by living in a cave, like whether it's a deep cave or just an overhang type of thing. So I think it represents a Christian's like choice to live in that place. But I think a lot of it has to do with seeking out peace, like seeking out silence. Like, and a cave brings you that. I mean, if anyone's been in a cave, like it is a very different silence. It's like, it's probably one of the quietest places you can be in nowadays, unless you're in the middle of a desert or something. Athanasius, sorry, you want to say something?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah, it's interesting to hear you guys speaking about caves as a like as a good thing because I don't know how to put this in plain English, but back in Zim, there is a lot of mysticism and yeah, like
Isn't there like some Goma deep in a cave and people go and it's very scary?
yeah, literally like
Is
there's
that in Zim? I saw a documentary about these guys. I thought it was like in Uganda or something. They go to see a witch doctor and it looks like something from the movies where they climb down. It's like a deep cave and there's a guy living in there with like all the sorts of muti and stuff.
yeah, exactly. So there's specific places that are now touristy. So for example, there's like
Okay.
Chinoi Caves, which is very touristy and it's very nice. But like even when you go there, I don't know about now. I went there as a kid, but even when you go there, there's like you're always told, don't make funny comments. If you see something funny, don't say anything. People have seen mermaids here. The water is so still. Like that's the vibe. And then like just in general, like there's a general sense, even from like people who are Christian or not, there's a general sense of caves and mountains are places where
The
like
evil spirit.
I don't use the word
Wow.
sacred, but I think spiritual would be the best translation. And
Yeah.
but not necessarily like good spiritual. There are some places that are pilgrimage sites. So there's like an Anglican martyr, Bernard Mzeki. There's a pilgrimage site there, and then there's this one Catholic. I think they're gonna make him a saint. I'm not quite sure, but like there's this like mountain where you used to go pray, and now it's like a leprosy center. So those, I might not know my facts, but those are the two places where when I think of caves or mountains, it's good. But in
Actually,
general, like the tallest mountain in Mountain Yangani, like the tallest mountain in Zim, like there's caves there, and there's
Hmm.
just these spooky things that happen. In fact, like there's some like so it's just very new to me.
But I think you're right. So the thing is, you're right, because remember now when monastics went to the desert in Egypt and the Jordanian desert, they weren't going to go, it wasn't like they were going on a holiday to get away from, oh, there's so much trouble in Jerusalem. Let me just go to the nice deserts. They were going for spiritual warfare. And there was an understanding. It's interesting in the Christian understanding and the Jewish understanding that the demons, the devil roams the deserts, the wild places. The demons are there. So we don't even realize how frightening it must have been for these men, going out into the Egyptian desert and these places, which also was pagan, and like praying in these graves and places that were probably very spooky and lots of weird spiritual stuff happening. I mean, it still happens all the time, and so I think it's like redeeming the cave, like Jesus redeemed the cave, like by entering into the cave, which was death, and then bringing light and life to it. And so I think part of it, maybe subconsciously, was them turning those caves, if they were existing caves, or making caves that were the opposites, right? So
Yeah.
maybe we need the saint to go into Zimbabwe and reclaim those caves and make them holy and full of light and
Yeah,
joy.
we definitely need that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of these places that are capable of being holy sites are also places that are capable of being the most sort of unholy,
yeah.
dark places.
Because it hasn't been filled with that. So then,
whether it's like forest groves or
Yeah,
mountains,
a mountain,
caves,
high
rivers.
places in the Bible, it talks about high places as being places of idol worship, because
Yes.
they would set up idols on high places like mountains and things. So it can have a dual purpose. It can be used for good, or it can be used for an altar. It can be an altar to this one true God, or it can be an altar to the demon, right? So yeah.
I mean, you were talking about how the cave is sort of representative of it's a reflection of one heart as sort of that inner sanctum,
Which can also
that
be
can also be
Yeah.
like the source of holiness or
Yeah, you
opposite.
can have demons there, you can have angels there. But also, I think caves are also like, it's like the other world. Like if you look at mythology as well, it's interesting because in mythology, oftentimes there's like the hero or whatever goes into a cave, like the underworld, especially like Greek mythology and stuff like that, and get something out or whatever. Yes, Monet. So I think this
I,
is also something about the caves. It's got like a lot of threads come through the cave. Like I don't know. Is Monet?
I just wanted to say Muhammad also met his angel in a cave that recited the
He's
Quran
an
to him.
angel.
His angel with inverted commas, in inverted commas.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's interesting. So let's we can think what that cave was inhabited by, but yeah.
So they talk about, I think, all these sort of places as liminal spaces and places for transformation. So caves, rivers, mountain tops. You see a lot of like pivotal moments in the Bible happen with someone ascending a mountain.
Yeah. Yeah, as much as we want Christianity to be like disembodied and not related to like geography and stuff like that, it is like, and God has designed the world and placed us in this garden that can be paradise with these liminal spaces that are for us to experience goodness of God and not, you know. And I think because we are embodied beings, like our head is the highest part of our body, which is why when a branch falls from a tree, we cover our heads because the head is the most important part. So it's the same like when you climb a mountain, you understand that the top of the mountain is the most important place because it's touching the heavens. Like so you feel it is like a liminal space. And the cave is an otherworldly, it's a new world. It's like being a frog and going under the water. You're in a new space. Like and it is mysterious, like because the light in the cave is not sunlight. It's the light that you bring. And that in itself has got lots of, and it's casting shadows, and it's a different space. Like so, and I think Christians mastering the cave, maybe let's turn it into something like that. Like Christians taking back the caves is like maybe symbolic of even Anthony, like bringing Christ into this pagan Viking society. Like the darkness of that society. Like that's also a cave in a way. You know.
You even have stories of when Europeans went to places like the Himalayas, or even Kilimanjaro.
Yeah.
Like, so I mean, these people weren't going out with any kind of explicitly Christian purpose, but they came from a culture that had been Christianized, and they come to these places and they want to go to the top of the mountain, and the locals are like,
Don't go.
I mean, don't go. Like, if you want to, okay, but like, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to go where the demons are?
Yeah.
But I suppose things are different post Christ.
Yeah.
You can go to those places and redeem them.
That's interesting.
Well, I think also talking about mountains and caves as like it could be light and evil, but it makes me think of the sort of dragon slayer, going into the dragon's den to kind of conquer the demon of the, to put that's the demon that's terrorizing a village or something like that,
Yeah.
So these places where the wild places where all these demons are, I think we are drawn to those places to kind of tame them or whatever you will, heal them
or like it's maybe even like fear, like it's scary. Like I mean, I remember as a kid going into caves, like go to Kango caves, or I mean Athanasius had the scariest experience of us probably himself. but going into a cave, it is kind of scary. So like it's kind of like that human like longing to overcome your fear. And like I would say that like the fact that Anthony turned these caves into a place where people are literally seeking him out and want to go in the caves and find him and go pray with him. And the thing is, I don't know so much about the cave setup, but they were in there and praying in there without sunlight. It's not like it was an overhang. They were entering into these deep tunnels and praying and doing liturgies and living in these caves with candlelight, with one little candle. It was very different life, And so I lost my train of thought here, but basically, so Anthony did kind of like overcome like maybe fear of death. You know, that is a symbol of death as well, being in this dark hole. Like, and yet now people go line up to go to the Kiev. Not so much anymore, but people talk about it now. But go to the Kiev monastery or go to the Pechir caves in North Russia or wherever, you know. Okay. Oh, there we go. Thank you. We're gonna go take back the caves of Chennai.
The church is like a whole bunch of those liminal spaces in one, because it's often sort of rock and a bit dark and lit
Yes.
most with candles.
Yeah,
The altars sort of you're ascending a mountain.
it's the highest.
And they're often
That
built on
place.
the high spots.
Yeah. Well, so, yeah, that's interesting. You know, churches. So Constantinople or Istanbul is very interesting. So if you go to Hagia Sophia, it's a very dark space actually. It's got the lighting is very. They have galleries that are recessed, so they're in more shadow, and like lots of windows, but they put lights in very specific places. But generally, it's a calming space. They say because it's not lit up so much. And then you go not so far to the Blue Mosque, and it's literally like there's so much light, and people actually say they get. I couldn't be listening to Christians with biases, but they say that it's very like overstimulating. Like the spaces, there's so much light. You can see like the hairs on the carpet, you know, of Persian rugs. Like it's so much light, and actually like praying is a very different experience. I'm not gonna say it's worse. Should just be like I should be generous here. It's not worse to pray there, let's just say, but it's different. And the Christian churches, actually, the traditional ones, if you go to old countries, they're quite like
Cave-like.
cavernous, yeah.
Cavernous.
You know, in the sense that they are dark, and the candlelight is understood. Like you can feel the candles and things like that. So I think that also lends itself to inner prayer. Yeah. Anyway, I don't want to keep us too long. Thank you, everyone. Oh, yes, no, of course, yeah, don't worry. We'll definitely go with this. Thanks, everyone. If there are no more questions, then we'll wrap it up for tonight. Thank you so much. God bless. So we're entering into the second millennium now of Christianity. So, and I promise to do find the life of a female saint because we've had too many male saints now. Anyway, God bless you. Thank you all so much, and have a good evening. Bye.